Today's video, I'm just going to share this old historical source and share a few things from it that I think are interesting. But it just reminded me of this Freemason that I used to work for. And I've told about it before. I used to work for a Freemason and literally out of a Masonic lodge. And this Freemason, he would always make references in his work to Pliny the Elder and similar ancient historical types, but specifically Pliny the Elder. And nowadays, I think it makes sense why a Freemason might be really interested in something like that. And I think it's because they knew the truth, at least some of the truths, that history is mostly a Freemasonic fabrication and a lie, and that if you want a real historical account, that you probably shouldn't read any modern interpretation, and you should go back seeking much older sources. And it's something that I've just connected with. Like, me personally, when I learn music stuff, it's not just that I do like Renaissance music and Baroque music, but I think that most stuff today is just not as good. And I don't believe the lie that they tell us about people in times past. This is just one of the biggest lies that modern society has to pass off, is that people in the past sucked the worst and they were stupid, and that today is the best that you could ever have it. That's a lie that they have to put off. And they're always talking down on people in times past, making up giant lies like, oh yeah, they threw poop out in the streets. And I mean, maybe that's what the people did right after the last historical resets, but the people who built the grand buildings and the grand cities with the huge undergrounds and all that, obviously that society, when they get to the point where they're building the skinniest little houses in there, there's no way that society is throwing poop on the ground. And anyways, that's just the example that always comes to mind. They're always doing a smear campaign on the past. But when you realize that, nope, history is a lie, when you learn what Freemasonry means, Freemasonry literally means that there's all sorts of masonry left around for free that people go and they claim as theirs. And I mean, I guess population hoax gets into this too. And I am going to talk about that later in this video, that today people think that the earth has never been this populated before. That's a huge lie. I don't even believe, I think that they greatly exaggerate the number of people. But if you just use your eyes and you fly in an airplane and you drive around, you'll notice, oh man, it's mostly empty space. Most people don't even own land today. And when you go out and you drive, it's mostly empty everywhere. And the cities really aren't full. There's so much boarded up today that, and like old stuff, old giant buildings that are just empty, mostly empty today. Well, I've already rambled a lot. But yeah, I think that it's just something I've been thinking about. My old, the guy that I worked for who was Freemasonic, now I know, oh yeah, he was super into Pliny the Elder because he knew history was a Freemasonic BS clown freak show. And so he understood the wisdom in ancient texts. And I think this is really an interesting old text. I think that it follows similar patterns to a lot of old texts. I'm into music and I like to learn. I don't want to take a modern music theory course. I want to learn what people in the Renaissance were talking about and what people in the Baroque era were talking about. And when you go and you read those texts, you notice that they had certain styles. And one of the styles that people wrote in were snippets. It's almost like the memes of today. Like they understood that people are really good at taking in small bits of information. Little example. They didn't write huge novels about these things. Let me kind of show you an example. A huge list. This is the numbers were really interesting here. Book 14, which is a double 7, and then it goes to 49, which is a 7 times 7. Persons of whom Alexander was jealous. And then you go and you read that, it's like a really short chapter. Each chapter is about one paragraph. And this is just something that I've noticed in old music books. That a lot of the old essays that were written about how to play music were written in this short snippet thing. They'd have a major topic for the section, but then it's like little sections. And it is a smart way to present information. And it's just something you notice. Like I've talked about before, how sometimes you're reading the Old Testament and it comes off like, wow, this seems like ancient Greek writing. This reads like a Socratic dialogue. Is that what it's called? Where somebody has an idea, they want to talk about something, and instead of just talking about it, what they do is they write it as if it were a monologue between people. To me, the book of Job almost feels like that. Like Job decided to tell his story through a dialogue in the style of a Socratic dialogue or Plato, how these people wrote. And this historical book in particular is ancient Roman time, which is cool. And that's not to say that everything out of this is true, because just like today, bullshit runs rampant. Back then, you have to assume that the same thing was going on. But I think in general, the historical accounts from back then are probably going to be a lot better than whatever people come up with today. All right, that's the extent of most of my rambling. Now I'm just going to go through and maybe skim through a few of these. Maybe I'll do a video where I really read through that and try to find interesting ones to talk about. I remember seeing the word eunuch at some point, so maybe it'd be interesting to search through there, see everything that they had to say about eunuchs. What is this? Was Dionysus a real person? Lovers of drink were Dionysus in Sicily. It seems like Dionysus was just a guy in Sicily. Maybe not a god at all, or were they named after the god? The lowercase g god? I don't know. Oh, there was something about tunnel. Oh, the last was called tunnel because putting a tunnel into his mouth, he could drink wine poured into it without taking breath. Some things never change. This was, this is talking about art. Go ahead and pause if you want to read any of these. They had a lot to say about art and how the common person has no taste, and you have to be an artist to understand artistic stuff, and it's usually not going to align with the common opinion, which I guess just goes to show you that most often what's popular is of low quality, and a lot of high quality stuff flies under the radar unless people have, I mean, honestly, what comes to mind are like outsider artists that people really see the value in their artistic abilities, even though they're an outsider. There's a lot of outsider artists that their work just blows you away. They talked about, these were just interesting. People that were well renowned for how much they could eat. A trumpet player who was very known because of how she could eat. She wore a periwig and a plume on her head. 12 pounds of flesh and 4 what is that? Choinixes of bread. Interesting, Cretans. Here I was wondering, were they trying to do a smear? Is the reason that Cretan has like a negative connotation was somebody trying to do a smear campaign on these people? The Cretans, or whatever, commanded all freeborn children to learn the laws with a kind of melody, that their minds might be enticed by their music, and they get them by heart the more easily. That's something that we still do today. We sing ABCs to a song, and it is very powerful to learn things through music. This is why the masses are brainwashed through music, because it sticks in your mind. So that if they committed anything contrary to the law, they could not plead ignorance. Imagine a society like that, where you go to school and instead of being handed a globe and talking about rocket ships and dinosaurs and stuff, it's like, all right, we're going to learn the laws. And you start singing the law songs. Very interesting. What was next? Next on the list was the hymns of the gods. So what I found interesting about this particular set of old history stuff, and I'm going to leave a link in the description and in the comments, is that it seems like this is a historical account of all of the pagans at the same time as the Bible. This very much to me, it seems like biblical times, Old Testament times, from the perspective of the pagan nations. So that's why it's interesting to me, and why I think that it's probably a better source. Just like I think King James is a better version of the Bible than, say, like the NIV, just because things become more corrupted over time. What we're handed today as modern history, I mean, look at what they do to NASA. They tell people now today that, like, black women are what got you to the moon. So that just shows you how history today, they can just rewrite it however they want to make whatever BS narrative they want. So going back in the past, I think it can only get better. If you really want to study history, this kind of stuff is interesting to me, but I knew going to school, when I was learning the forced world history and U.S. history, I knew that was boring. Part of me knew that was boring, and maybe it's just because I could sense it was a bunch of BS. That a lot of it did just not make sense at the time. And when you learn about freemasons, how they fake history, the Civil War really was civil. It was... I'm going to talk about that at the very end. There's weird... Old U.S. history does not make sense. I think that the United States of America is kind of a new thing, in that I think that the previous reset, when the United States of America, when this land was really great, I don't think that it was unified under one person necessarily, or at least the last reset. Like, who knows, when it goes back to Rome, all the way to Rome, like all roads lead to Rome ideas. There probably have been societies that own the entire world. But in particular, and something interesting to me, this is just a ramble tangent, is I think that there's so much evidence that in the last reset, what is USA was owned by many different people. And they'll just tell us like, oh, people were fighting over the new land. But no, what it is like Louisiana area was just owned by the French. And they were well established there. And it was connected to Paris, and similarly, England had the New England. New York was owned by England, but the societies were well advanced, and it was just almost a reset. So times were probably like this, but you had French speakers in USA, you had English speakers, you had Spanish speakers on the West Coast. That's just something that rings true to me, and it would be an interesting research point, that it wasn't the European powers trying to take over the new land. They're hiding a historical reset where those countries had well established, they had been living there for hundreds of years, and they all shared this land together. Anyways, let me know what you think about that random thing I've been thinking about for a while here. This was an interesting anecdote about Egyptian frogs. The Egyptian kind of frogs hath a peculiar wisdom, and far excelleth all other. For if a frog meeteth a serpent bred in Nilus, she biteth off a piece of reed, and holds it as fast as she can crosswise, and will not let it go. The serpent is not able to swallow the reed, because his mouth is not so wide as the reed. Thus the frog by wisdom overcomes and masters the strength of the serpents. I thought that was pretty cool. Since I'm maybe going to come back to this topic, let me know in the comments if you want me to read more of these, if you want me to read through this history and try to find really interesting ones to talk about. This was interesting. I guess in ancient Rome, you had to be a free man. And so women were not allowed to drink, at least wine. And you had to be a free man, and you had to be 35 years of age to drink wine. I thought that was interesting. People complain about 21 today, but ancient Rome had a drinking age of 35. You can pause and read any of these. I'm just going to flip through. This one was really interesting. I think you should read this one. Okay, so one thing maybe I'll just make another video on this. I'm just going to shove this in at the very end. The Toledo War. Part of how you can know that American history is really fishy. Standing on the shoulders of giants, the founding fathers. Founding fathers found this stuff. They didn't build it, they found it. And I don't even believe that, like, George Washington was chopping down the cherry tree is probably a metaphor for something. And I think that those figures already existed in Tartarian / whatever the previous reset, or maybe even the one before that. Who knows? But Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, blah, blah, blah. Those people probably existed, but we just make up stuff. We made up new names about them, and we made up new lore about them, and pretended that those were the people with starting this new reset. And you can tell that the populations are just not, they don't match. They're not, they don't make any sense. And that all of these places were already here. The Mormons, why did the Mormons go out to Utah? It's because they knew that there was going to be stuff out there waiting for them to occupy and because it was post-reset. And so I guess that's where if you were really, really advanced, you could try to really suss out exactly where the reset begins. It's like, you know what it reminds me of? Like those fake backgrounds where Wile E. Coyote, where the Roadrunner paints like a background. In history, at some point in time, there's like a painted background like that, where the road actually doesn't go into the distance. Somebody has just painted a background. And they're using the images, the iconography that already existed. And so maybe it's around the time of the Civil War. I don't know, but the Civil War is a bunch of BS. Freemasonic fake war. And look at this, the Toledo War. All I need to say about this is there was a war, allegedly a war, Toledo War, that involved like 600 people, 1,000 people. The populations don't make sense. They don't match up. That is way too little. Biblical times. This is the book of Numbers. In the book of Numbers, how many war-ready Jewish men were there? And so take ye the sum of the congregation of the children of Israel after their families by the house of their fathers with the number of their names, every male by their polls, from 20 years old and upward, all that are able to go forth to war, Israel, thou and Aaron shall number them by their armies. Even all they that were numbered were 600,000 and 3,550. There were over 600,000 of just this one people. Allegedly, way, way back in times. So what are we doing now in modern times, having wars that only involve 600 people? This is like survivors. These are survivor numbers. These are the people that crawled out of the caves, that are having their petty disputes over who gets what in the early reset. And this falls exactly, the timeline of this falls exactly in a really interesting part of history that people don't talk about, which is the Canal era. They have to explain everything away. You ever wonder, you go into the big cities that have a river running through it, and it's built up. Same thing with Paris, all of these cities. And they will have these ancient-looking pylons in the water. And that stuff had to be built at some point. Was it built by the 600 people that's the militia? That's the biggest army you can get for a war, like 600 people. And, you know, the ancient Jews had 600,000. The population hoax. Population hoax is that today people think that it's the most populous it's ever been. That's not true. We're living in the crumbs. So much of the old world has been demolished. And you could even get into the whole, if you read the fine print of the Georgia Guidestones, even though those are gone, it says something like, keep the population under. And I think that it could be shocking how low the real population is today. But anyways, the Toledo War is kind of an interesting thing, to think that they could be having wars where one person gets wounded, 600 versus 1,000. It shows you that it's just petty disputes over unclaimed stuff that's laying around. It just fits everything about history that makes you scratch your head. When you understand historical resets, you know that the Freemasons, they come in, they snatch up free masonry. When you realize that the Freemasons find masonry for free, and then they tell you a backstory about how they built it, it all falls into place. It all makes sense. And that's enough rambling for one video. I hope you enjoyed, and God bless everyone.